up. So as she said, we're Michelle and Kathy from OSU Extension, and we thank you for inviting us to be a part of the conference. We do prefer to provide this as a interactive presentation. We do prefer it to be in person, but however, as you can see, we're not going to be doing that. So we're still going to try to make it as interactive as possible. We did provide you with a handout previously that hopefully you have been able to print out. We will be referring to it periodically as we go through this. So typically we follow this presentation up with a poverty simulation that we provide a hands-on experience of where you are simulating going and living in a poverty situation, but due to COVID, we can't do that, but we hope that we can provide that experience to you in the future. Our lesson today will hopefully help to explain and personalize the complexity of poverty. We're going to be sharing with you some definitions and some statistics related to poverty, look at some existing programs, and hopefully end by making a personal action goal where you can help us address poverty. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to stop sharing and grab a different file here. I'm sorry.
I'll go ahead as you're pulling that up, Kathy. So for today, again, thank you for having us, and thank you for the work that you do in your communities. It's greatly appreciated, not only this past year, but in all times in our society. So through today's program, our objectives is we will try to understand the various definitions of poverty. We'll describe the current statistics about poverty and how it affects our communities in Oklahoma and in the nation. And we'll apply the issue of poverty to our lives and discover the importance of our action. And then, like Kathy said, we'll implement a list of personal actions that you can take regarding the issues of poverty and identify existing programs, including a couple which are already developed called Turning the Tide on Poverty Project, as well as websites and resources on the issues of poverty.
I still grabbed the wrong one. I'm sorry.
You're fine. So hopefully you all were able to, like Kathy said, print off or at least view the handout that we provided. But as we start this, I just want you to think about the realities of poverty. So if you would just close your eyes for a minute and just think about what I'm going to ask. So daily, we're given choices on how to spend our money. And if you were faced with a lack of income, what necessities would you choose to spend your limited amount of money on? So would it be for food? Would you spend it on gas money, childcare, electric bill, field trip for your child, past due bills, personal hygiene items, a bus pass, and then all the other things that come into our daily lives? How would you decide where you spend that money? And yes, it'd be difficult to decide how to spend your limited amount of money. So now you can open your eyes, and as you all know, because you live this world every day with the people that you serve, there are people every single day that have to make those decisions, and those are very, very, very difficult decisions to make. So we want to talk about the definition of poverty. So when on your handout, there's a place for that to put on the first page, your definition of poverty. So if you want to jot that down real quickly. And we wanted to talk about the actual definitions, and this is according to Google, is the Google definition is the state of being extremely poor, the state of being inferior in quality or insufficient in amount. And I don't know about you, but when it says inferior in quality, that can be very hurtful to see that, because the word inferior is less than. So think about that and the mental baggage that brings as the people that you're dealing with and that definition. Does anybody want to share their definition of poverty?
I put down not having enough money for basic needs.
Okay. True. Just like the list said, all of those choices, all those things that we need to provide daily, and then how are you going to choose which ones you're going to provide and which ones you're going to do without for you and your family? Okay.
Another definition that Dr. Ruby Payne, who is well known for her work in the poverty world, written several books, Bridges Out of Poverty, that you've probably heard of or even participated in some of those programs. But she offers a broader definition of poverty to give a different understanding of people living in poverty. She does take into account material things, cultural and social resources, not just the economic status as most others do when they define poverty. So her definition is the extent to which an individual does without resources. And those resources are the things listed there. So as I read through these, think about yourself in a time that you've dealt with a stressful situation, and did any of these resources help you as you went through those times? So the first one is financial, which is having the money to purchase goods and services. Emotional, being able to choose and control emotional responses, particularly to negative situations, without engaging in self-destructive behavior. Mental, having the mental ability to acquire skills such as reading, writing, computing, to deal with daily life. Spiritual, believing in a divine purpose and guidance. Physical, having physical health and mobility. Support systems, having friends, family, and backup resources available in times of need. Relationships and role models, having frequent access to adults who are appropriate, who are nurturing to the child, and who do not engage in self-destructive behavior. Knowledge of hidden rules, knowing the unspoken cues and habits of particular groups. Also coping strategies, being able to engage in procedural self-talk and the mindsets that allow issues to be moved from the concrete to the abstract. And then some additional ones that we've added to her list are integrity and trust. Trust is linked to two issues, predictability and safety. Can I know with some certainty that this person will do what he or she says? Will it occur every time? And the second part is safety. Will I be safe with this person? And then motivation and persistence, having the energy and drive to prepare, plan, and complete something such as projects, jobs, and personal changes. And formal register, having the emotional control, vocabulary, language ability, and negotiation skills to succeed in school and work settings. Now, all of these resources, or the lack thereof, has an impact on our ability to handle stressful situations. So if you think about a financial or a person who is financially strapped, but they have an abundance of these resources, they're eventually going to be doing well or better than they were. They're going to have resources to help them get out of that financial situation. But on the other hand, if you have someone who becomes wealthy, but they lack all of these resources, they're not going to remain wealthy very long. Just think about someone who's won a lottery. So with the programs that we all work with, they have the definition of poverty that's based on money. So poverty thresholds, that is what the U.S. Census Bureau has determined or uses. Poverty guidelines is what U.S. Department of Health and Human Services follows. So we're going to look at those two a little bit more. So when you look at poverty thresholds, and again, that's by the U.S. Census Bureau, they're going to include household size and household composition. The total household cash is going to have income included. It's going to include cost of food and basic services, but not necessarily all of the living expenses.
Hey Kathy, I think you may be losing your connection a little bit. You're cutting in and out.
Well, it looks like we lost Kathy for a little bit. Hopefully she'll get right back on. So while we're waiting, I'll go over some of the chat that people were responding to. And so yes, as far as the definition of poverty, it could be a taught lifestyle, and absolutely it's status quo. It's what they know, so they don't know any different, and it's just the way of life for them. It's a lifestyle that you can't break out of, very difficult to break out of. Also includes systems, structures, and policy choices that foster circumstances. And we're going to go over a little bit of that later on at the end of the program. And then Terry says that she is blessed because she has most of those resources, and that's what helped her desire to start a food pantry.
Hey Michelle, I can pull up that presentation and share my screen if you want to lead us through the rest until
Sure.
Kathy rejoins.
Absolutely, thank you.
The screen's pulled up. Give me 1 second. There we go. All right, you may have to remind me what slide we were on.
I think she ended on poverty thresholds.
This one?
Yes, okay, yes, and I think we're pretty much, you can go to the next one, is fine. So in Oklahoma, this is a table is a partial view of the poverty thresholds in 2020. So the left side is the family side unit, and the right side is the number of related children. And you guys, probably a lot of you use this kind of a guideline to determine eligibility. So for example, under 65 years of age, for one individual, it's 13,465. A person with a total cash below the threshold of 13,465 is considered to be in poverty. And then I won't go over that whole slide because probably you all have seen this and use it almost daily. Okay, next slide. So the poverty guidelines defined by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services is the poverty guidelines is determined to use a household qualifies for most government aid programs. The numbers are very similar to the Census Bureau's poverty threshold numbers. The big difference between the two is that the poverty guidelines allow for differences in living cost between Alaska, Hawaii, and the continental states. Another difference is that the guidelines do not take in account a person's age. And so this is the third difference is the poverty guidelines that do not define income. Instead, the programs use the guidelines determines what counts as income, which can be a challenge for someone seeking assistance. Also, each program can determine what percentage of the guideline has to be met in order to qualify, such as 125% or 200% of the poverty guideline. So for example, a program may say that a household can qualify for benefits if it falls below 125% of the poverty guidelines. Next slide. So here's an example of the free and reduced school program, lunch programs that are used in the poverty guidelines. So to qualify for this government aid, household incomes must be less than 185% of the poverty guideline to receive reduced meals and less than 130% of the poverty guideline to receive free meals. So those kind of, that table just shows you the difference from 2015 to 16, 19 to 20. And we know you have a large area that this conference covers. So we just pulled out a few that could hopefully relate to some of your areas. Okay, so in poverty rates by state in 2019, the map shows the poverty differences. The legend on each map indicates that the darker the color, the greater the percentage of poverty. So you'll notice how the majority of the states in dark or medium dark colors are in the South. And then notice how Oklahoma compares with its neighboring states, as well as the other parts of the country. So anything surprising there, anything that jumps out to anybody? Okay, next slide. So hopefully, yeah, you can see this. This is the percentage of the respective percentage of poverty in each county. So the data came from the US Census, and the map on your handout has the same data, just the background colors are different. We couldn't find a map with the current census data matched up with color coding of the map. So basically the colors mean nothing on your handout for this purpose. But on the map, the green and the blue areas have the highest percentage of poverty, with the blue being the highest. And then the yellow and orange are the lower areas, with yellow being the lowest. So another comparison from the US Census Bureau compares the US and Oklahoma with a few of our counties. And the first column is poverty for all ages. The middle column is those under 18 who live in poverty. And then the last column is the median household income. So you can see the vast variety of differences between counties. Oklahoma poverty percentage for all ages is 15.10%, which is still higher than the national average, which is 12.30%. Mississippi has the highest poverty rate at 19.5, and Oklahoma is number 8. The two counties listed in yellow, the yellow section, represent the highest and the lowest percent of households in poverty. McLean has the lowest, and Okfuskee has the highest. So hopefully we were able to kind of represent at least some of your counties, but I know you cover a large area. Okay, so imagine, this is, again, if we were in person, this would be a lot different, but imagine that you were told you have 10 minutes to gather your items before you're evicted. So think about what items would you take with you? And again, this is on your handout on page 3. There's a box there. What would be the hardest things to leave behind? So you have 10 minutes. You may have a car, you may not have a car. You may have to put things in a bag to get on a bus or to have somebody come pick you up. So think about the things you would gather quickly, and why did you choose the items that you took and the items that you left behind? And then obviously, how did it feel to make those choices? Heartbreaking. And how will you go on with the things you left behind? So let's say you had to leave a majority of your clothes. Now, how will you function without those clothes? How will you function without some of your children's items? Where will you get those things now? So where would you get the things that you need, but you're no longer able to take with you? Okay. Now, if we were in person, we would have set some bowls out on the tables as you walked into the room. And in those bowls, we would have, some were full of chocolate, some were full of hard candies, some would have oyster crackers, and then some would be empty. And we wouldn't give you a reason. We just had those throughout the room. And at this point, we just wanted you to kind of think about, is poverty fair? So based on where you sat down is where your bowl, you got treats, or you got nothing, or you got some dry crackers. So think about it. How would you feel in the way in which the candy was distributed? Anybody want to chime in real quick? So your first, oh, maybe somebody's.
I think that that person would feel isolated or alone or hurt, offended.
Okay. All good choice. All good words to describe that. Offended, hurt, alone, like nobody else is. Why did I get an empty bowl and somebody else got chocolate? Obviously, were you treated fairly? No, just based on where you sat down. If you were in that situation, would you have shared your chocolate with somebody else? Or how many of us would not even notice? Go ahead, Kathy.
I would probably share or ask for a piece of somebody else's because I'm a chocolate fan. So
Okay. So you would reach out if you noticed somebody else had chocolate and you had nothing. You would think, hey, there was a mistake. Why didn't I get any chocolate? And a lot of us wouldn't even notice. We would just think that everybody's bowls had the same thing in it and go on with the conference. And so think about how all of those thoughts relate to poverty. Is it fair? Is it equal? Is it just by chance where you sat down? Like we said, the generational poverty. And do you go about your day without thinking about it? Now, I know with this crowd, that's different because you deal with people that need assistance daily. But in the general scope of people in our community, do we just go on without thinking about it? And then think about how this experience relates to wealth in our society. Okay, the next thing we want to talk about is the impact of homelessness with our students. So typically we would have a student with their backpack. We usually have a student that just volunteers to bring their backpack for the day, or in this case, we would have asked one of you to maybe borrow your children's backpack if possible. And then we have an example of a backpack of a student who is homeless. So this helps us with the reality of homelessness for our children. So next, you can hit the next. Let me move my screen. Oops, okay. So think about the things in a normal backpack. Would a child who is not homeless have a can opener? And obviously they need that because, as you all know, a lot of the cans that they receive require a can opener. The stuffed animal or the baby bottle might represent somebody they left behind, or it could represent their childhood, a memory. They had 10 minutes to pack. This is one of the things that they took with them. They also need their utensils and ketchup, things like that, because obviously they don't have a kitchen. The beer can, think of a beer bottle, and this could be their source to hold liquid. So they don't have a refrigerator to go to drink their water. So it could be an empty water bottle, it could be an empty beer can, something to hold the liquid, or they could have a issue with drinking. And then they have the other things also that a lot of other students would obviously have, their workbook for school, some makeup, maybe a change of clothes. But think about them sitting in a classroom with all of this other stuff versus just a student with their homework and with their basic get to school and get home kind of things. Next slide.
Okay, I think I'm back, Michelle.
You're back.
I'm sorry. Technology is great when it works. I'm sorry.
That's okay. It's teamwork.
So this is one of our activities of making it personal. We like to hand out a index card to everyone and ask you to share a time when you or someone close to you has struggled with poverty of any kind. But because we're virtual, we can't hand out the cards. So as I read through some stories that were shared with us, I'd like to ask you to just try to listen for some similarities and some differences for these stories. So I remember as a child living in a shelter with my mom. It was scary and my mom cried a lot. After a month or so, we went to live with my aunt until my mom could afford for us to live on our own. My family didn't have much when I was growing up. I wore the same clothes often, and some of my classmates made fun of me. I remember a teacher bought me a coat and the counselor gave me new clothes and personal care items. I was able to pay my bills with the income I received from my job until my daycare closed and I had nowhere to leave my children. I lost my job and had to seek assistance to help feed my kids until I got back on my feet. My church family were a big help. My daughter's husband died and she was left with lots of financial issues. She lost her home and car. We lived in another state and we tried to help her as much as we could. She and her teenage son lived with her in-laws for a while and then moved to a home owned by a family member. We were all humbled by how the community surrounded them, including their church, to help them. One of my best friends in elementary school lived in a very poor home. The only water to their home was with a water hose. The floor was very uneven, almost like linoleum laid directly on the ground. Both parents had jobs, but it was difficult for them due to various issues preventing them from getting ahead. Most people had no idea of their living conditions. So next slide. So as I read those stories, what were some similarities that you saw and what were some differences? Anyone want to comment? You think back to the resources that Ruby Payne identified. I think for some of us, it was, we heard the word family a lot. We heard church family. So, some of their support system stepped in. Financial was definitely in a lot of them, spiritual. So, as we each experience poverty differently, the resources that we have available to us can help ease that situation and can also give us a feeling of having having inadequate money. So why is it important to look at these stories and look at our own stories and think about them? Well, it helps us relate to poverty. It helps us maybe put a face on poverty. It helps us connect the issue of poverty to our lives. It helps us walk in the shoes of other people. Okay, next slide.
So we talked about some community programs when we were beginning this program, and their variety of successful community programs have been used to help fight poverty. The common objective of the programs is to involve a wide range of community members in fighting poverty and by using local talents and local resources. The programs include 2 stages: productive dialogue, and that dialogue leads to action. 3 of these programs have been used are Bridges Out of Poverty, Circles, and Turning the Tide on Poverty. The Turning the Tide on Poverty was a pilot tested program that began in 5 states in the South, and Okfuskee County was one of those sites. And our extension office was involved in that. Some of the reported actions that have been accomplished through that program and the other programs were they helped the residents to overcome apathy, so the lack of interest or the lack of concern. They caused small communities to see similar issues and learn together. And they found employment for some persons who were receiving TANF, which is temporary aid to families to needy families. Helped create community unity and pride. They created community vegetable gardens, created food pantries, clothing closets, community resource directories. They planted fruit trees, and they created a farmer's market. And some of them developed an action plan to improve the quality of their local schools. One state even credited their program with helping stop a growing trend of youth gang violence. So if you want to know more about these opportunities, you could reach out to your local extension office. So every county in Oklahoma has an extension office. So if you need help with that, feel free to contact Kathy or myself, and we would be happy to point you in the right direction. Next slide. All right, so as you all know, poverty is everywhere. The face of poverty may look different given the location versus a large city versus a suburb or rural. Poverty may also be viewed and experienced differently by individuals. So some people who look at poverty through their past and current experiences and their environment. For example, a person who grew up during the Depression may view poverty differently than a person who was just laid off from a very successful, high-paying job. Or a newcomer to the United States may view poverty differently than a person who lives in a community where almost everyone is poor. But no matter what, the challenges that come with poverty reach across all types of communities. People have different views about what causes poverty and why. One view simply cannot tell the whole story, which is what we were kind of talking about earlier when you mentioned some of that in the chat. And you may not agree with all of these reasons or one in particular, and that's okay. but just be open-minded and think about the variety of reasons why poverty may exist in some people's lives. So one of those is just bad things can happen. You have a pandemic, you have an illness, you lose a job. Poor education, poor schools is another reason. Not enough jobs or only low wage jobs. So like Kathy was saying in the example, two people were working, they just didn't have enough to provide for their family. The content with status quo, like we mentioned earlier, it's normal. You don't know any different, and this is just the way that things are. Bad public policy. People don't take responsibility. A division by social class. A lack of support network, like we were saying with Ruby Paynes, your family support, your friends support, and a growing number of single parent families. Those are just a few of the reasons that were given for why poverty exists. And they don't stand alone typically.
Okay, so since I missed part of the presentation, Michelle went through the statistics and the maps. The main takeaway that I think you should really from that is that Eastern Oklahoma has a high poverty rate. Oklahoma has a high poverty rate. We're in the South, so do other states surrounding us. But there are things we can do. Also realize that, you know, those people who are in poverty, how I think that they're in poverty may not be how a program determines how it's in poverty. It's how they, what definition, what, do they follow a threshold? Do they follow the guideline? What is their guideline?
Done with this.
And so it can be different for various programs. They may qualify for one program and not qualify for another. So it can be frustrating and hard to navigate those systems for a lot of people who are living in poverty. So what our goal is that we would like for you to be hopefully more aware of that poverty is a problem here in our area, but also to be inspired to take action. You have a section in your handout titled I Can Do. We would like for you to think about what you can do to help your community break that cycle of poverty. We would like for you to write that goal down. We all know that we're more likely to do something if we write it down and we plan for how we're going to take action. So it may be something that you can do for by yourself, or it might be that you involve your family, your friends, your neighbors, the people you work with, or some group that you're involved in. But think about what can you do to be a permanent part of the culture of the community to break the cycle of poverty. So you can go to the next slide. We do thank you for inviting us to be a part of your conference. You can continue on to the next slide, please. Michelle and I's contact information are there. We hope that in the future we would be able to provide a poverty simulation to you, because that really brings it to home as to some of the frustrations and some of the things that people living in poverty have to go through. But if you have any questions or comments, we would welcome those at this time.
It looks like we